In the explosion of criticism over Amazon's Rings of Power, there are many people upset over the portrayal of Galadriel, dubbed Galadriel by detractors of the show. The argument is that she has been made far too masculine, that she has been reduced to a warrior princess, a tomboy figure swinging around a sword, rather than the graceful, divine feminine philosopher queen that Galadriel is supposed to be. This is true. I've spoken briefly in a previous video about the modern entertainment industry's strange insistence on unsexing female heroes, stripping them of actual feminine power and giving them instead a veneer of masculinity. In another video, I will talk in greater detail on what seems to be the deliberate unsexing, uglification, and disempowerment of the character of Galadriel by Amazon Studios. But in this video, I want to bring to attention one particular reason why Amazon, in removing and condensing most of Galadriel's original backstory, completely changing her motivation, and redesigning her as a sword-wielding soldier hell-bent on revenge is, despite what they try and tell us, a complete failure to create a unique and empowered female character. Instead, what they've actually done is given her a characterization more akin to one of the male figures in the mythos, a character who was actually her enemy, her fundamental opposite. To explain this, let's revisit the lore. In Tolkien's Silmarillion, Melkor, the world's primordial source of evil, steals the Silmarils, 3 great luminescent jewels that contain within them the essence of the 2 trees, Laurelin and Telperion, the light sources of Valinor. Fëanor, king of the Noldor elves, who created the Silmarils and coveted them above all else, falls into despair. Seeking to recover the jewels, motivated by anger, selfishness, and greed, and manipulated by Melkor into rebelling against the Valar, he persuades many of the Noldor to go with him to the west, to Middle-earth, where Melkor, now given the name Morgoth by Fëanor, had fled. He promises the Noldor that the journey to Middle-earth would bring them glory, treasures untold, and new lands over which they could rule. Galadriel, proud, strong, and self-willed, joined the flight. Eager for adventure, she had early absorbed all of what she was capable of the teaching which the Valar thought fit to give the Eldar, and she yearned to see the wide, unguarded lands and to rule there, a realm at her own will. Even though in Fëanor she perceived a darkness that she hated and feared, she agreed with him when he claimed that life in Valinor was holding back the elves from realizing their full potential, not perceiving that the shadow of the same evil had fallen upon the minds of all the Noldor, and upon her own. Motivated by her own prideful desire, she became a leader in the rebellion against the will of the Valar. The elves left in 3 hosts, the first and largest led by Fëanor, the second host, more reluctant, led by his younger half-brother Fingolfin, and the last, smallest and most reluctant, led by his youngest half-brother Finarfin, Galadriel's father. The host of Fëanor left first, and arriving at the coastal city of Alcolonde, attempted to persuade the Falmari, the sea elves, to aid them, to provide them with ships for their journey. But the Falmari refused. They attempted to persuade the Noldor to stay, and when this failed, tried to throw them out. The Noldor possessed no ships, and little to no ability in shipbuilding, but were desperate to be on their way, and a fight broke out. Their sea elven kin was slain, and the Noldor stole their ships. For this kinslaying, the Noldor elves were cursed by the Holy Valar, dispossessed, forsaken, forced, essentially, into exile. The Valar Mandos pronounced a judgment on the elves, the doom of the Noldor, declaring that, among other curses, that they were doomed to fail in their quest. Despite this, under Fëanor's leadership, they persist in their journey to Middle-earth and their pursuit of Morgoth. The host of Fingolfin set out on the journey later than Fëanor's, and caught them up at Alcolonde. They join the battle halfway through, and unwittingly participate in the kinslaying, believing that the Falmari had drawn first blood. There are a couple of revisions in Tolkien's writings of Galadriel's involvement in the kinslaying at Aquilonde. An older version has her accompanying the remaining host of Fingolfin, which continued to follow Fëanor, the host having become dissident and critical of Fëanor's leadership as the journey grew darker and more dangerous, are betrayed. Fëanor takes what is left of the ships, much of the fleet having been wrecked by storms, for himself and his most faithful, slipping out under the cover of night and then burning the ships upon reaching Middle-earth. The host of Fingolfin, seeing the flames flicker from across the ocean, but fearing shame and judgment should they try and return home, are left with little choice but to continue on, travelling to Middle-earth over the vast and dangerous icy expanse of Helcaraxe. In one of the latest versions of Tolkien's writings, Galadriel is said to have had a ship of her own prepared at Alcolonde to sail her to Middle-earth, as she was half a Falmari herself through her mother. When the host of Fingolfin reached Alcolonde and witnessed the battle raging, Galadriel fought in defence of the Falmari elves and managed to save her own ship. Galadriel sailed to Middle-earth separately from the hosts of Feanor and Fingolfin, but as one of the initial leaders of the rebellion, thus sharing in the blood guilt, and by sailing out during the embargo laid by the Valar, she was also exiled and banned from returning home. However it was that she embarked on her journey, when she arrives in Middle-earth, she lives for a time in the forest realm of Doriath, where, by one account, she then meets and marries the prince of Doriath, Celeborn, and befriends the Malar queen, Melian. In Amazon's TV show, all this history is absent. Instead, the elves go to Middle-earth to wage war against Morgoth for the destruction of the trees. Eventually successful in this war, Galadriel's motivation becomes to avenge the death of her brother, Finrod, who has died in battle fighting orcs by carrying on his hunt for Morgoth's lieutenant, Sauron. In Tolkien's writing, Finrod is of the host of Finarfin, the smallest and most reluctant host, and the last to set out for Middle-earth. They do not reach Alcolonde. Hearing about what happened, the kinslaying and the curse, on their journey towards the city, they turn back to seek forgiveness from the Valar for having set out at all. Finrod, Galadriel's brother, despite not having participated at all in the kinslaying, still did not wish to abandon his brothers and chose to accompany the host of Fingolfin across the icy waste to Middle-earth. Finrod did much in Middle-earth, including founding cities and a kingdom of his own and teaching the elvish language of Sindarin to men. He eventually dies in battle from a mortal wound sustained after he destroys, in a bare-handed fight, a werewolf sent by Sauron to devour him. Galadriel arrived in Middle-earth around the same time as her brothers, but took no part in the wars that followed. At the end of the First Age, after the defeat of Morgoth by the Valar, the Noldor rebels are pardoned, the ban is lifted, and the elves are offered safe passage back home. But Galadriel chooses to stay in Middle-earth. So, what has been done here? Amazon's Galadriel is motivated by a desire to avenge her brother's death and hunt down the remaining evil forces. It is this desire that, in the TV show, stops her from returning with the rest of the elves back to Valinor. As a side note, it's ironic that our modern feminist hero's motivation is also borrowed from another. She starts her quest not necessarily because she heeds a personal call for it, but because she must pick up her brother's mantle. There's nothing inherently wrong with this, but it's an intentional departure from the original personal motivation of Galadriel to better herself and her station. This is something we keep seeing in revisions of established female characters. Take, for example, Lara Croft, a 1990s character who originally set out in search of treasure and glory for the pure love of adventure, defying her parents' wishes, who, now in modern reboots, only does so because she wants to complete her father's quest. In Tolkien's work, Galadriel's journey to Middle-earth and her decision to stay is motivated by her own ambition to be greater, to gain new knowledge, and fulfill her desire to establish her own realm over which to rule. Although after the kinslaying, Galadriel initially burned with desire to follow Feanor with her anger to whatever lands he might come, and to thwart him in all ways that she could, her wisdom overruled her anger. She chooses not to get involved in the war against Morgoth, having witnessed the horrors at Alcolonde, having lost so many of her brothers in subsequent battles, and knowing that defeating the Dark Lord was beyond the power of the elves. Instead, she trains her magical understanding under the tutelage of a Maya of Yavanna, and endeavours towards establishing a land of light, Lothlorien, a stronghold, refuge and sanctuary, where the shadow cannot penetrate, where no evil thing dared come, an island of peace and beauty, a memorial of ancient days. Amazon's Galadriel is single-minded when it comes to her revenge quest, and is even shown in the first episode commanding a band of elven soldiers through icy wastes, endangering them, even coldly abandoning one to die, and although her company becomes critical of her leadership and is reluctant to follow her, she insists that the journey must continue.
Commander! Wait! No! We keep moving! Galadriel! Stop!
In many ways, Amazon's Galadriel, as she's been introduced to us, is actually more like Feanor.
Why do you keep fighting?
Because I cannot stop.
One-track-minded, stubborn, aggressive, lacking foresight, manipulative, irrational, dismissive of her companions' concerns and lives, and hell-bent on chasing a dark force through Middle-earth to get revenge.
I can still feel the light of the trees on my face. I can still see it. And until we are certain, every trace of our enemy is vanquished, I can never return.
But this characterization is antithetical to Tolkien's Galadriel. Galadriel and Feanor shared similarities, as enemies often do, but they were opposed to each other. As Tolkien writes, opposition to Feanor was a dominant motive with Galadriel. While Feanor sought to imprison the light of the trees because of his covetous nature, Galadriel gifts it to another to aid them in their quest against evil. While Feanor sowed distrust and caused rifts between the elves and brought about much suffering, Galadriel established unions of friendships between the elves of Valinor and of Middle-earth, between the elves and the dwarves, and between elves and men. When Feanor begged Galadriel to let him have a strand of her hair, she refused him 3 times, but not Gimli, to whom she specifically gave 3 strands, because she recognized that Feanor made the request out of vanity, to use it to increase the beauty of his crafts, while Gimli requested the gift so that he could make of it a symbol of friendship between elves and dwarves for generations to come. While Feanor and Galadriel were the greatest of their kind, she was wiser than he, and her wisdom increased with the long years. Feanor eventually met his prophesied doom soon after he landed in Middle-earth, dying in flames from wounds inflicted by the Balrog Gothmog, realizing in the end that he was indeed no match for the might of the Dark Lord Morgoth. And yet, even as he dies, he commands his own children to hold their oath and continue the impossible quest. All 7 of his sons, having taken an oath to retrieve the Silmarils, continued the hunt. Feanor's line ended when his grandson Celebrimbor is killed by Sauron. Feanor's spirit now sits in the halls of Mandos until the end of time, denied the ability to re-embody due to his evil actions. But Galadriel lived on throughout many wars, established her realm, and had her children. Crucially, she aided the Fellowship of the Ring against Sauron in the Third Age, and in doing so became an ancestor to the restored line of Númenórean human kings, great-grandmother to Eldarion, son of King Aragon II Elisar. As a ring-bearer, she showed strong restraint and defiance against the whisperings of Sauron, and her initial pride, her desire for power, is softened and overcome, demonstrated when she successfully declines the one ring offered to her by Frodo. Though she seemed it her duty to remain in Middle-earth while Sauron was still unconquered, she did not wage war. Galadriel stands apart as someone who makes an entirely different decision, to take on a role not of a soldier, but of a nurturer, a protector, a guardian, a settler and diplomat, a healer, a wife and a mother, one of the last defenders of high elven lore and beauty, and a progenitor to kings of a new age. But Amazon has taken all this away, and in their lust to strip from Galadriel what actually makes her great and make a masculinized female hero out of her, they seem to have, intentionally or accidentally, given us a female Feanor instead, a villain, and her polar opposite. It's a great testament to Tolkien's work that in trying to rewrite it, the showrunners have only strengthened his writing, bringing to light this dynamic between the 2 figures and the danger that Galadriel, with her pride unsoftened, and without her characteristic divine femininity, wisdom and restraint, may have become her villainous uncle. Incredibly, the elven heraldry that the showrunners chose to design and emblazon upon Galadriel and many of the elves we see in the show has been identified as being most reminiscent to that of Feanor's star. While there is still and will always be a lot of debate about this, it's interesting that so many people had this initial recognition. The language of symbology conveys information in subtle and powerful ways, and sometimes through channels beyond our control. I wonder, were the costume designers consciously aware of what they were doing here, or does this portray an underlying design for subversion that exists within this production? It remains to be seen whether or not the showrunners intend to stick with this characterization throughout the series, or actually develop their character into Galadriel.